So I'll do at 6. As we celebrate Black History Month, we also take a look at some of the serious issues impacting African Americans.
And one issue that can't be ignored, the violent history between the African American community and law enforcement. Now, in recent years, police shootings made global headlines. Victims like Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and countless others. And the resulting social justice protests led by groups like Black Lives Matter lasted for days at a time, often pitting protesters against police.
Denver 7's Jessica Porter spoke to one veteran Denver law enforcement officer with unique perspective on the relationship between what his book calls the black and the blue.
We never had to deal with that before, and we have to deal with it now.
In his book, The Black and the Blue, Matthew Horace reveals the crimes, racism, and injustice in law enforcement.
For people who would say that there is no racism, I either think they have their heads in the sand or they just intentionally don't want to acknowledge it, because people who look like me and look like you and look like others can tell story after story after story, and we're not making it up.
Wait a minute, that's not right.
Horace says injustice starts with policy. He busted down doors during the war on drugs in the late 80s and early 90s, when mandatory sentencing laws led to mass incarceration in the black community.
Well, I've been on search warrants where we were looking for 5, 10, 20 grams of crack cocaine and arresting 8 people in a house when we find it.
And compared it to the now growing opioid epidemic that affects mostly white communities.
And we have officers that have been provided with Narcan to provide heroin addicts who possess. Heroin is an illegal drug. You know, it's an illegal drug. It's not legal. So officers are not arresting people who are high on heroin and they're giving them help.
It's not just policy that leads officers to target certain communities. Horace breaks down the hiring practices, lack of training, and flat-out bias that leads to so many police shootings.
Some of the cases we talk about, like New Orleans and Chicago and others, these are people that should never have made it into police academies. And they're given a lot of authority with a gun and a badge and the authority and permission to go out and enforce laws.
From the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, to Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, he tries to answer the tough question: how did we get here?
The public, by and large, still doesn't understand policing. So escalation of force and use of force continuum and how we get from, talking to a person to empty hand control to intermediate force to use of deadly force.
Horace says to change the disproportionate number of African Americans being killed by police, a lot more must be done.
Well, I think a lot more can be done. I think there has to be a commitment for wholesale criminal justice reform in the United States, not just in policing, but in the judiciary, the prosecution. The public has to understand, have greater empathy and greater compassion.
Jessica Porter, Denver 7.
Oh, powerful. And all month long, we're celebrating Black History Month in our Colorado. You can find in-depth stories on this topic right now on thedenverchannel.com and on the Denver 7 streaming apps for Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV.